who will tell us about systemic injustice in social networking platforms today.
Right, thank you very for the introduction. I know with those online, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right, thank you very much for the introduction once again. My talk today, Philly has introduced me already, Abraham Tobi from University of Johannesburg, Philosophy Department and the African Center for Epistemology and Philosophy of Science. My talk today is titled Epistemic Injustice in Social Networking Platforms. And okay. Yeah, so the central question I'm trying to answer in my talk today is whether the possibility of anonymity should influence the way we think about epistemic injustice. So in general terms, traditionally, when we talk about epistemic injustice from Friedman's iteration of it and further arguments about epistemic injustice, the basic idea is that an agent is treated unfairly in their capacity as a knower. And in most of these cases, these happen in interpersonal interactions, right? Person to person, or even when these two people are not speaking to each other directly, there's a general understanding that both agents know who is speaking to the other person in the context of epistemic injustice. But with the internet comes this possibility of anonymity, right? Where epistemic agents can post things and not be known. You can choose to be anonymous online, and there is almost a sense that the amount or the level of accountability or responsibility that an anonymous agent has is different from the one that a known agent has. So if we are to apply this general idea of epistemic injustice, because obviously it's something that happens in our daily epistemic interaction, it's also something that can be translated into our online epistemic interactions. If we translate our understanding of epistemic injustice more general to the online space, how can we understand it? Is there a different way? Are there other things that might come into play? Yeah. Okay, so taking that into account, my aim in this talk would be to argue that in cases where there is a potential for anonymity, right, our focus when we talk about epistemic injustice shouldn't be on the agent versus agent interaction, but we should focus more on the ideological elements behind the issue being talked about. So we shouldn't look at who is talking to who. Is it a white person versus a black person? But what is the content of the discussion that they are having in cases where there is this possibility for anonymity? And this pushes the focus now from epistemic agents per se to epistemic communities or marginalized groups or marginalized communities. So if we understand these communities as having, as being at risk to certain epistemic vicious practices, then we can think of that community as the victims of epistemic injustice rather than just focusing solely on the epistemic agents. Now, just a quick outline of my talk. I've introduced it and spoken briefly about my aim. I'll present the central case that I'll use throughout the course of my presentation, and I'll just give a quick rundown of some of the core concepts of epistemic injustice that I am interested in. And then I'll look at epistemic agents on the internet, right, as a different category now, and try to bring both together and tease out the central problem a bit more. Now, with the existing literature on both the epistemology of the internet and epistemic injustice, I would look for possible ways forward, but I would argue that what exists in the literature currently might not be sufficient to tease out cases of epistemic injustice when we have this element of anonymity. So in those sort of settings, I'll give a proposal for what I think might be a clearer way for us to understand epistemic injustice in those kind of contexts, and I'll just conclude and provide a brief summary. Now, for my central case, it's just going to be something very straightforward. Now, imagine Bongani, a Black man, complains about his experience of police brutality. And he says part of the reason why he experiences this is because he is a Black person, right? So the reason why he experiences police brutality is as a result of his race, which brings in the issue of prejudicial stereotype. Now, John, the white man, does not believe Bongani because he thinks Black people always falsely complain about police brutality. Now, with our general understanding of epistemic injustice, we are able to see how Bongani is a victim of various kinds of epistemic injustice if we look into it further. But just to say some things about epistemic injustice to tease out the central intuitions for the argument I'll be making, let's think of Fritta's initial definition of epistemic injustice. It's something that we mentioned on slides already in the course of our talks today, so I won't focus too much on what has already been said. But basically, this is the sort of harm, epistemic harm, done to a knower in their capacity as an epistemic agent. That's just the basic idea of epistemic injustice. And now, from Fritta's initial conception and the two kind of strands of epistemic injustice that she identifies, lots of other strands, right, have been identified since then. And there's a very rough way where we can break most of them into both of these strands. So with the initial one identified by Miranda Fritta, testimonial injustice is just basically the idea that your testimony does not get the credibility that it deserves due to prejudicial stereotypes against you. So think of Bongani in the example I just talked about. The reason why John does not believe Bongani's testimony is because he is a Black man, and John believes Black people lied about their experiences of police brutality. So Bongani does not get the credibility he deserves because of his testimony does not get the credibility it deserves because of prejudicial stereotype. And then we have Andrew Pitts, who argues for some sort of interpretative injustice, right? And this kind of interpretative injustice, you do get some level of credibility, but it's not the right kind of credibility you're looking for, right? These are cases where your words or whatever you say, your utterances are given a level of credibility, but it's skewed to the intentions or what the dominantly situated knower in that context wants your testimony to do for them. So you do get some sort of credibility in these instances, but it's a false kind of credibility. Well, it's not the kind of credibility you're looking for ultimately, because in Pete's argument, what eventually occurs when you're a victim of this kind of injustice is some sort of epistemic silencing. And basically, the argument that Pete uses is similar to most of the strands of epistemic silencing you see in the literature, where the basic message is you don't get the appropriate communicative reciprocal response from your communicative acts, right? So when you don't get that, that's the sort of harm that generally occurs from instances like this. And now, just to talk about the hermeneutical strands of epistemic injustice, Balamohan in his talk has already talked about hermeneutical injustice, and for Fritta, when hermeneutical injustice occurs, it's as a result of hermeneutical marginalization of members of a particular social group, right? And the basic definition is this: you don't have the appropriate hermeneutical resources to make sense of your experience within a particular social context where you subscribe to the shared hermeneutical resources there. Now, Gail Paulhaus argues for willful hermeneutical ignorance, right? And this idea of willful hermeneutical ignorance, these are cases where these hermeneutical resources exist within your community, within your larger community, but it's not part of the dominant epistemic resources or hermeneutical resources, simply because for the intentions of the dominantly situated, they find it better to marginalize whatever hermeneutical resources that arise from marginally situated within the society. And then Christy Dodson also argues for contributory injustice. There are senses where contributory injustice is similar to the general idea of willful hermeneutical ignorance, in the sense that these epistemic or these hermeneutical resources exist, but they exist within the marginal societies, and it just doesn't get the sort of uptake, right, within a larger epistemic community. And so these are, so in general, right, these are not all the kinds of epistemic injustice that you could encounter or that has been theorized in the literature, but it gives a good general picture of the sorts of things that happen when there is an instance of epistemic injustice. Now, with these theories on epistemic injustice and and how they could occur, what's up there that's not showing is some central features, I think. Yeah, one of the central things in cases of epistemic injustice is that there is a differential power relation. So when Fricka talks about epistemic injustice right from the beginning, it's embedded in the power relation that appears within a particular society. So those who are considered as dominantly situated and those who are considered as marginally situated. And this differential power relation is central to the marginally situated being victims of epistemic injustice. Another key feature to epistemic injustice is that there is almost always an identity prejudicial stereotype that accompanies this epistemic injustice, in the sense that when someone suffers from testimonial injustice, for instance, or when a particular group experiences hermeneutical marginalization, it's because as a group, there are certain stereotypes about them, and there are certain dominant discourses, right, that dominantly situated would want to maintain in order to cling on to this power that they already have. So these prejudicial stereotypes now become the ground for which members of this group do not get the appropriate credibility that their testimony deserve, or their hermeneutical resources are not welcomed within the larger epistemic community. And one other element, right, and this is mainly for the hermeneutical strands of epistemic injustice, is the element of hermeneutical marginalization. I think Mohan talked about it a bit more in this talk, so I wouldn't go too much into it, but it's basically the idea that as a certain group or as a group of people, your epistemic resources are not welcomed within the larger group, and this is the deliberate action of the dominantly situated within that society. Now, just very quickly, two of the ways, and obviously there are lots of other arguments, right, within the literature on how we could approach epistemic injustice, or how we can approach a world where there is epistemic justice. But two of the things mentioned by Fricka in her initial work on epistemic injustice is the idea of the responsible knower, responsible hearer. And where she talks about this responsible hearer, where she argues that when we experience this epistemic injustices due to the testimonial injustices and hermeneutical marginalization that we experience, it's possible, or it is the case, that these people who experience epistemic injustice are silenced, right? They lose some sort of their capability as a knower, their ability to communicatively make sense of their experience. And Fricka argues that being a responsible hearer now be something that will help you with this element of not being the one silencing people, so to speak, right? When you have some sort of responsibility in your hearing, and it's also related to the idea of reflexive social awareness, which is basically know your situatedness as a dominantly situated knower, and this sort of knowledge can help you imbibe some epistemic virtues that will make it easier for you to avoid committing epistemic injustices. Now, if we look at my central case again, we could see how if John decides to embody these sorts of epistemic virtues, so to speak, he might have a different response to Bongani's experience, right? If John acknowledges his dominant situatedness, we'll be able to know that, yeah, okay, maybe Bongani has a point. Maybe I don't know so much about the Black person's experience in that context. But now let's imagine that now Bongani, now this interaction, let's say it's happening online, right? Not just in a traditional epistemic encounter. Now, if we imagine it as something that's happening online, then we need to look at some of the features that the internet offers to us as epistemic agents. Now, one of the things that the internet offers us is a wealth of information and gets almost anything we want online. Even the things you don't want, they are available for you online. So there is that wealth of information. And James Tobi argues that this wealth of information, in a sense, right, can be a way to democratize knowledge. It's no longer something situated, say, within academic institutions, but it's open to everybody and everyone can be participant in epistemic activities, in terms of them being able to share their work and them having access to the epistemic activities of others within their larger epistemic community. Another aspect of the internet is its ability to create echo chambers and epistemic bubbles for us. Now, these 2 points of the internet are good for, by saying, when I hope I'm saying the name correctly. Yeah, when it talks about echo chambers, right? These are just like spaces, right, within the internet where members of certain marginalized group can go to share their experiences, where everyone within that group, right, are able to share similar experiences. Now, it's not always the case that these spaces are used by just the marginalized for good epistemic practices. It's also possible that these are spaces where like reason is blocked out and people just go in there and say maybe very racist or very sexist things, and it's a gathering of like-minded people perpetuating these epistemic vices. So that's a possibility within these spaces. But these spaces also has the positive aspect of offering a voice or a platform to marginalized people where it makes sense of their experiences. So for instance, in the initial presentation this morning, in Q's presentation, when people, for instance, that have these sort of medical conditions are able to, say, form a chat group and talk about their experiences of that condition, it provides them with useful epistemic resources. So in a sense, make sense of what you're going through, and also to maybe form useful hermeneutical resources to share this experience with other people. So there are aspects of this that are beneficial. And one other central thing that the internet offers to us is the element of anonymity, right? You can have a fake account and that's fine. Now, with most of all these things, the wealth of information, the democratic platform, the echo chambers and epistemic bubbles, there's a benefit that anonymity can have in all these aspects of the internet. So say, for example, I'm within a society where if I speak up against the government or say I am homosexual, and I say it out, I get arrested by the government. If I can have an anonymous platform where I can share this, my experience within that society, this element of anonymity gives me a way to make sense of my experience. So there is this positive aspect to anonymity within the internet. But there is also the negative aspects, and something I'm sure most of us are familiar with, when people create fake accounts and act as trolls and say racist and sexist and homophobic things online. This now is a negative aspect of anonymity within the internet. But I think in all, there are lots of positives with anonymity that I wouldn't off the bat recommend throwing it out like entirely, right? Maybe we need to reorient how we understand people's anonymous assertions or testimonies within the internet. Now, some of the ways that we could do this, right, are things argued for by Chris Walden. The idea of epistemic sorting within the internet is basically like the idea that when you go online, you need to watch out for proper markers of credibility within online spaces. You need to sort through the wealth of information available to you and not just take anything you get there as it comes to you. And another thing, Richard Hersnick, hope I'm saying that correctly, argues for epistemic virtues of the internet. These are basically general epistemic virtues that we would have, but applied to the internet space now. It means, for instance, you're more vigilant to bad epistemic practices within that space, and that sort of vigilance makes it possible for you to, again, perform a proper sort of epistemic sorting within the internet space. So these are like two ways that maybe we approach the vices that the internet exposes us to. Now, if we want to combine the idea of epistemic injustice and the internet, Gloria Urigi and Serena argue for epistemic injustice in cases of digital environment. And the basic question they try to point to in their argument are like, what aspects of the digital condition impinge on our idea of epistemic injustice? Now, from their arguments, there are like two cases they consider. I'll just briefly go through it to give us an idea of the sort of arguments now relating epistemic injustice to the internet space. They gave an example of someone who uses Google Maps, right? And yeah, got one, saw one day, like, yeah, according to Google Maps, you're at a certain location which you were not at. Now, for most of us, there are lots of times I know I've experienced it. I got home and according to my Google Maps, I was somewhere that I don't remember going to that day. It just randomly picks up your location and stuff like that. Now, in their argument, when something like this happens, say for example now, I get arrested for shooting someone at Campus Square. I was never at Campus Square. They take my phone and my Google Maps say, yeah, I was at Campus Square, maybe because I drove past there or because of whatever is going on within the system. Now, this creates a case where I experience testimonial injustice according to their arguments that I am not able to, like the testimony of the internet technology in this instance is taking over mine. And yeah, there are the points here now of where the credibility deficits lie or the prejudicial stereotype is not very clear in the arguments they make. And this is one of the points I'll be pointing to shortly. And in terms of hermeneutical marginalization, you think of algorithmic profiling within the internet and how most of us don't know how we get the ads we do, but we get ads that kind of speak to what we are looking for, who we are, right? Again, we don't have access to the sort of hermeneutical resources that lead to the creation of this knowledge about ourselves. So that's the dimension of hermeneutical marginalization that you point out. However, even though this is the case, right, some of the key elements of epistemic injustice, right, seem to be missing. So some of the things I mentioned initially, the differential power relationship, it's not clear how there's a different power relationship, like who is the agent in this context? I'm saying the internet technology in a sense is the agent. So right, it's not clear who the agents are in this context and how there's a different power relation. It's also not clear how prejudicial stereotype plays into this account of epistemic injustice within the internet. Because again, this is something that anyone of any race or any social class can experience. And although I get the point of hermeneutical marginalization slightly, but I'm not sure it's the same kind of hermeneutical marginalization we get or we think of when we talk about it within the epistemic injustice literature. So if we include these elements, now the different power relation, prejudicial stereotype, and hermeneutical marginalization, it seems when we talk about epistemic injustice in online spaces, we shouldn't be focusing so much on internet technology versus consumers of the internet as epistemic agents, right? But on the interactions between actual epistemic agents in online spaces. Now, remember our initial case, right? Bongani and John. Now, what kind of thing can the internet add to this case that makes it different? We know Bongani is a Black person, sending his message or his complaint through his phone. And now let's say John uses the element of anonymity, has an account where he claims to be a Black person and says the same thing that he said, like, yeah, I don't believe Bongani, Black people, we like lying about our experiences of police brutality. Now, on the face of it, we have almost like a believable agent, right? In the sense that this is someone who belongs within that social group and they are saying something about their experience as members of that social group. But we all know deep down it's John in there, but we are seeing Bongani as the face of it. Now, when we have this sort of cases of like where someone can act as an imposter to say things that are deleterious to the marginalized within a certain society, we say that epistemic injustice in the internet, right, can't just focus on the agents speaking to each other, right? Because we still agree that this fake John saying, yeah, whatever Bongani is saying is false, still in a sense counts as an instance of testimonial injustice. But we don't see the different power relations in terms of their social identity as Black people. However, if we look at the idea, right, if we look at, well, if we ask to find a solution now, say from what exists in the literature, we see Fricker's argument for a responsible here and reflexive social awareness. And then we put that together with the argument for being proper epistemic agents, where we need to do some sort of epistemic sorting and applying some epistemic virtue. What's going to happen is probably going to be that we would believe this fake John, right? Because say a white person sees John saying, nah, Black people lie about the experience of police brutality. If this white person is to imbibe all these virtues and listen to John and take John's testimony seriously, then we should believe that white people, that Black people lie about their experiences of police brutality, right? So there's a sense where these sorts of epistemic virtues and this reflexive social awareness might not be beneficial in these instances to flesh out the epistemic injustice that might be occurring. Rather, it might help further this epistemic injustice more. Now, my proposal is that in cases of this potential anonymity, right, we shouldn't be looking at agent versus agent interaction, but we should try to focus on the injustice in that situation in itself. That's our attention now is no longer on two epistemic agents talking to each other, but two ideas or two ideologies in interaction with each other. So in these sorts of cases, it's no longer an issue of, yeah, it was said by a Black person online, so yeah, maybe it's true. There is the possibility that that's a white person disguised as a Black person, right? So when there is this possibility for anonymity, my argument is that we should focus rather on what is being said. Is it the idea of a dominantly is it an idea that is beneficial to the dominantly situated group versus deleterious to the marginally situated group? If that's the idea in conversation with each other, then we should be looking at, yeah, it's still a case of epistemic injustice, irrespective of the agent that appears to be furthering that idea. So, yeah, that's basically the argument I'm trying to make. I started off by asking whether this possibility for anonymity in online spaces might have an effect on how we understand instances of epistemic injustice. And the central argument is that it does have an effect, and as a result of this, maybe within online spaces, we shouldn't look at epistemic injustice in terms of agent versus agent interaction, but we should look at the ideologies being traded and see if it's the case that it's the ideology of the dominantly situated versus the ideologies or the positions of the marginally situated within those spaces. Thank you.